Hi, welcome to Brown Bag History today, and it's October 12th, I believe, 2022, and we're going to be talking about Queen Victoria Hospital and healthcare in Revelstoke. We start by acknowledging that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Sinixt territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, or Silks, and the Tanaha to this land. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So Revelstoke's first doctor was a little bit of a character. That's him with the beard in his photograph. It's Dr. Dugald McAlpine. And he was born in Scotland in 1836 and practiced medicine in London, Ontario for 25 years before heading west to Medicine Hat. He practiced there for 2 years, and then he came to Revelstoke in 1884 when the town was just being established at the time of the construction of the CPR. And at the time, he brought one of his sons with him, Johnny, and his wife and the rest of the children arrived from Medicine Hat, and he built a home on an island just that no longer exists, just on close to the west bank of the Columbia River, just opposite of the Front Street area, and was known as McAlpine's Island for years. But earlier than that, it had been a traditional spot for the Sinixt for fishing and use near their village in the Big Eddy. So there was mentions of in the papers of what were referred to as Colvilles coming up from the States to access, and going on to McAlpine's Island. But anyway, that was where he lived. The story from the family was that downtown Farwell or early Revelstoke on Front Street was very Wild West at the time. There was a lot of gambling and brothels and such like drinking. So he didn't want his young family living in the midst of that. That's why he built his house on the island. With the very first temporary school in Revelstoke was taught by one of his daughters, who was 17 years old at the time and was given a temporary license for teaching. But he was only here for a few years. The family moved to Vancouver in 1887, and he practiced there. The family was very well known in Vancouver for many years. He passed away in 1911 at the age of 75. This is an interesting photograph. I'm not sure exactly who's who in the photograph, but one of the sons, I think he was the one that became a doctor as well, is holding the skull there. As far as we can tell, Revelstoke was without the services of a doctor for a few years. I haven't been able to find any mention of a resident doctor until 1892, when Dr. Ernest Henry McLean came to Revelstoke, and I don't have a photograph of him, but at the time that he came to BC, there was a smallpox outbreak underway, and he was appointed medical inspector for the eastern part of the province, checking passengers on trains running between Donald and Revelstoke. And after that job was over, he set up an office and drugstore on Mackenzie Avenue. Dr. William Boyd Mckechney, seen here in the slide, was the next really well-known doctor in town. He was born in Ontario in 1867 and received his medical degree from the University of Toronto in 1895. And he came west to Revelstoke and Donald as a Canadian Pacific Railway doctor. In June of 1897, he established Revelstoke's first private hospital in a home that is still standing at the top of Douglas Street Hill, 1106 Douglas Street. You can see it, little house on top of the hill on the left. His brother-in-law, Dr. F.W. Jeffs, and his sister, Margaret Mckechney, and his niece, Mary Merker, joined him in the new enterprise. Mary Merker, who later married local businessman A.E. Kincaid, was Revelstoke's first nurse. The hospital at the time could only accommodate 15 patients, and it was a privately run hospital. According to an anecdote that I haven't been able to verify, the first patient was a young sawmill worker who was working south of town and broke his leg. He'd arranged earlier for his fiancée to come to Revelstoke by train, where they would be married and then travel south. But on arriving in town, the young woman found her fiancé in hospital. So she arranged for a minister to come and perform the ceremony at the hospital bed. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, because I've also found an account about Charles Holton being the first patient of the hospital, where he'd lost a finger in an accident. So that first story could just be a cute anecdote, but it is cute. So in March of 1901, the Revelstoke Hospital Society was incorporated. There was no provincial authority for healthcare at that time. It was up to each community to look after their needs and build a hospital. They could generally access some funding from the province, but it was up to communities to look after their needs for a hospital. So the Hospital Society was incorporated, and they acquired land on what was still part of the Farwell property then, on Block 57, and that is where the Alpine Village Mall is, and Save on Foods. But you can see that there is a cross street, an angle coming through there. That was Government Road, and it had been built as a quicker way to get from the stores down on Front Street and Douglas Street to the station. And it angled right from Victoria Road all the way down through, bisected the property that was the high school and the later Mountain View School property, angled right to 3rd Street, and then continued down to Farwell from there. The last little vestige of Government Road is the little angle outside of the Lordco, and the axe throwing and the terra firma kitchen. So that was the last little bit of Government Road. The street itself was or that angle was taken out in the 1970s. But you can see how it affected the land there. So that was the site of the original hospital, which was referred to as a cottage hospital because it was a little frame building. So in May of 1901, members of the Hospital Society met with a representative of the Victorian Order of Nurses. And that was a major organization that supplied nurses throughout Canada. By July, they had come to an agreement that the Victorian Order of Nurses would subscribe $1,500 toward the hospital, and they would supply nurses. And their part of that deal was that the hospital had to be called the Queen Victoria Hospital, Cottage Hospital. So that's where the name Queen Victoria Hospital comes from that very earliest agreement with the Hospital Society. So right away they started fundraising for the hospital, and they laid the cornerstone on September 29th, 1901. There was actually a royal visit happening at the time. Along with it was one of the sons of Queen Victoria was traveling across Canada, and along with them was the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Lady Minto, who they were at the time that her husband was the Governor General of Canada, and they also with Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Lady Laurier. And so Lady Minto was the sponsor of the Victorian Order of Nurses at the time. So she officially laid the cornerstone. The Ladies Hospital Auxiliary, which still exists today, was formed on July 17th, 1901. They had a man as an honorary president, B.R. Atkins, one of the members of the Hospital Society, but the rest of the organization were the women in the town. They quickly collected $1,172.63 towards the cost of the building the hospital through their fundraising efforts. And they paid for all the bedding for 12 beds and continued to, they would have like pantry showers and linen showers for the hospital as well. Usually when you'd have an organization in town in those days, the board would be all men, but they would have a ladies auxiliary that would be responsible for raising money, doing fundraising, looking after furnishing, in this case, the hospital. So the ladies auxiliary was a really important part of the structure of the hospital society. There was, we have the early minutes of the hospital society here. And at one point in the early days of the society, there was mentioned that there was a dispute between some of the women in the auxiliary, and that one of the major complaints was that some of the church denominations were more dominant than others within the board. So the men's board, the hospital society board, made a ruling that there had to be 2 representatives from each church denomination on the hospital auxiliary board. They could have as many members as they wanted, but they wanted to even out the board in terms of representation by the denominations. And at the time, that would have been probably Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, and Catholic. Would have been the really probably the only, possibly Baptist, but most likely just those 4. So as we know, the hospital auxiliary, which is no longer referred to as the ladies auxiliary, but it's still in existence and doing some really great work, which I'll talk about a little later. So the hospital was opened in August of 1902. The Revelstoke Herald newspaper of August 14th, 1902 had a little headline, "The hospital opened." The hospital was unexpectedly called into requisition last Thursday, 2 accident cases being brought in. Fortunately, Nurse McKinnon, who was sent out by the Victorian Order of Nurses to take charge of the work here, arrived the previous day and was on hand to look after the patients. Nurse McKinnon hails from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and comes highly recommended, having had large experience in hospital work. And that's her standing on the steps in this photograph. She attended for 3 years the training hospital at Philadelphia, after which she was engaged in Victorian Order of Nursing work at Hamilton, Ontario. Prior to coming to Revelstoke, Nurse McKinnon opened a small hospital under the auspices of the Victorian Order of Nurses in Santa Luta, Assiniboia. The Revelstoke Hospital Society has every reason to congratulate itself on obtaining a nurse of Miss McKinnon's experience. And at the time, they had one other nurse in 1902, Miss Josephine Levesque, and a Chinese man who was their cook. The following year, in April of 1903, Elsie McKinnon married the CPR superintendent, Thomas Kilpatrick, who also happened to be chair of the hospital board, right from its inception in 1901 until they moved away from Revelstoke in the early 1920s. So he came under a lot of ribbing by the hospital board for stealing their matron, because at that time married women couldn't work because they had a job that was running their household and raising the children. So they had to find a new matron at that time. We've got a note this was in 1908, the charges at the hospital for ordinary cases. A special visit was 75 cents. If you had 2 visits in one day, it was $1. If one day or night, if they're there for a whole day or night, it was $2. 3 days or nights were $6. A weekly stay was $12. Maternity cases, the first visit was $1. Subsequent visits were 75 cents. And operations would cost you between $1 to $2. But of course, there was no healthcare at that time. The hospital also had an agreement with some of the major employers, like the CPR and a lot of the big forestry companies as well, so that those companies would pay for the healthcare of their workers. In July of 1908, there was the half-year report. That year, the matron reported 43 inpatients, 370 outpatients, 39 dressings, 182 operations, and 7 for the month of June alone. An annex was built onto the hospital in 1910, brick annex, by the contractors Foote and Pratolini, who also built the courthouse and several other buildings downtown at a cost of $16,000. It opened on September 1st, 1910. But very shortly after that, they realized that the original cottage hospital wasn't really serving the population that well. The population had really grown in that period. And there was decision made that even with the new annex, that they needed a new hospital. So they made plans for the new hospital, and that was the one that most people are familiar with. That was here until the early 1970s, and you can see the profile of the hospital there in this fire insurance plan. The building at the back was the nurses' residence, and the cornerstone was laid on August 21st, 1912. It was laid by the Honorable Thomas Taylor of Revelstoke, who was the Minister of Public Works. And very quickly, the building went ahead. You can see there's the building under construction. And all the scaffolding going up. It's unusual for us to have photographs of buildings under construction, so I was really happy that we had these ones showing it being built. And there it was after completion. It opened on June 18th, 1913, and this photograph would have been taken shortly after its opening. It cost $85,000. And it was built by O.W. Abrahamson, who's also a local contractor. He built the Style Trend and the McKinnon Block, which is now Explorers Society Hotel. So he was also did a lot of building in town, and the Revelstoke High School, which is now the distillery and old school eatery. So the hospital was officially opened June 18th, 1913. The matron was Miss Jean Matheson, and she had come here from Kamloops, where she had been matron at the hospital there. And I think she was probably actually headhunted by Dr. Hamilton, who was one of the prominent doctors here. The ladies auxiliary hosted an at-home, so that was people could come and see the hospital, and they were all encouraged to bring items for either a linen shower and pantry shower for the hospital. Jean Matheson was she'd actually come to Revelstoke in 1912 and was responsible for sort of managing the hospital during the construction. And she signed up as a nurse for overseas duty during World War I. She served 2 years in Salonika and was decorated by King George V for her work there. She had charge of the Clearing Hospital at Liverpool until the close of the war, and on return was appointed as a matron at Shaughnessy Hospital in Vancouver. She held that position until a year before her death in 1938. So quite an amazing woman. One of the things that she did while she was here was establish a nurses training school. And it was quite a successful school that trained quite a few women, both from Revelstoke and from the surrounding area. So there were women who'd come from Salmon Arm and other places, even from Alberta, to graduate here. The first class graduated in 1917, and this photograph here is the night of the 1918 graduating class. And wanted to mention you can see the two doctors in the photograph. On this side is Dr. J.H. Hamilton, known as Harry Hamilton. He was born in Ontario in 1882, graduated in medicine, and then joined his father in Nelson, who was a CPR telegraph operator and dispatcher. In 1904, as a qualified doctor, he went to work at the new Alexandria Hospital in Arrowhead, which was operated by the Revelstoke Hospital Society. It wasn't in operation for too long. And in 1906, he came to Revelstoke, where he worked as a doctor until his death in April of 1938, and was really a very well-known doctor in town. He was one of the primary doctors here for many years. During World War I, he served overseas as a medical officer with the 54th Kootenai Battalion. He died at Enderby of a heart attack on his way home from a curling bonspiel in Vernon at the age of 56. And on the other side is Dr. Sutherland. He was born in Prince Edward Island in 1876, graduated from McGill University in 1899, was a house surgeon at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, and then came to Revelstoke as the superintendent of the Queen Victoria Cottage Hospital, supervising 5 other doctors. He was mayor in 1912, he was a magistrate, and then was elected as a member of the legislature for the province in 1916. He was Minister of Highways and Public Works during that time. And Dr. Hamilton was also mayor of Revelstoke for a couple of terms. But Dr. Sutherland moved to Vancouver in the 1930s as a resident doctor of the CPR Hotel Vancouver. So they were both really prominent in the medical field in Revelstoke. And we have actually in our collection, we have quite a few medical books that have one or both of their names in the book. So they were here for a long, long time, as they say, and quite involved in the community. There's another photograph of one of the nursing school graduates. In 1921, Miss Amy Smythe was the first Revelstoke-born nurse to graduate. The school operated until 1935, when it closed down because they didn't have enough students and didn't have enough medical cases here to really properly train the students. So a lot of the students who had been going here were transferred to the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster to complete their training. So there were a lot of Revelstoke women who ended up doing their training at the Royal Columbian, and then also later at Kamloops. So I just have a few pictures of some of the nurses here. Their cute uniforms. Some of the same people, but a little less formal photograph. This was Nurse Vera Nelson, the young patient. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that was Vera Benison. And some of the nurses having fun with their skeleton and sort of a medical dummy. This was Revelstoke actually had an isolation hospital for a short period of time. It was built on the corner of the mall, the shopping center corner, where they just put in the electric car charging units. And it was built there in 1922, and it was meant to be an isolation hospital for like contagious illnesses. Before that, if there'd be like smallpox or typhoid or other even cholera a couple of times, outbreaks in the very early history. And they would sometimes just commandeer like a local hotel and keep everybody in there for a while. And then they'd have arguments that would last a good year about who was going to pay the bill to the hotel for having those patients there. Sometimes they would just sort of rent maybe an unused shack on the outskirts of town and put patients in there. So it was never ideal. So they finally did actually build a dedicated isolation hospital in 1922, but it never saw much use. And it was moved down to Lower Town. I can't remember if it's on 2nd or 3rd Street in the lower part of town, but the house is still there. You can recognize that curved doorway. And probably in about the 50s, it was moved to, that's where Harold Chevron and later Keith Chevron station was located. There was various ambulances in town. Prior to 1920, the ambulance was basically just a horse-drawn cart. And the community got its first motorized ambulance in 1920. This was a little later one, which I'm not sure why it was painted black, but that's a little more ominous than the white one. This is Joe Farmelo, who came to Canada from England, where he had been a chauffeur for a wealthy family. So he did a lot of driving in town for various things. I just have a few more photographs of the hospital. So anybody who was born here before 1970 was most likely born in that hospital. So I've heard a lot of people, usually whenever I post this photograph on social media, I get a rash of people talking about that they were born there, and various other memories of, usually not that great, memories of being in the hospital. But it was certainly an iconic building in Revelstoke for many years. We all have photographs. I didn't include any, but sometimes there was a visit of the Governor General during Golden Spike days, or the Lieutenant Governor in 1944, and they did a picture outside of the hospital. So it was really an iconic local building. That's possible that was, you can see the flag there, that could have been for one of those visits. The color photograph. We have a lot of photograph in the Dickey collection. You can also see the Cenotaph outside. And the Cenotaph, when they took out Government Road, that was moved over to its present location. It used to be in a little triangle that was created because from that angled road from Government Road. This is a photograph just showing the part of the Legion building, the original Legion building, which was the old cottage hospital. So when they built the brick hospital in 1912, they moved the cottage hospital over to the Legion corner. And after it was used by various groups until near the end of the First World War. It was taken over by the Great War Veterans Association, which became the Canadian Legion. And it operated as the Legion building until it burned down in about, I think, 1962, and then was replaced by the current Legion building in 1963. So it had a long life even after it was decommissioned as the hospital. This is the director of nursing in 1968, Mary Taves, with a new baby incubator that was purchased by for the hospital by the nursery auxiliary. We know that they purchased one in 1950, so I'm not sure if this is the same one or if they'd replaced it before that time. But this was in a newspaper in 1968. Just talk about some of the other doctors that were here. This is Dr. Henry Eric Hamer. He was born in London, England in 1914. Came with his family to Saskatchewan when he was 6. His future father-in-law loaned him the $50 he needed to enter the University of Toronto. $50. He married Pat Hamer in 1841, and they settled in Revelstoke, where Pat had been teaching high school since 1938. Henry joined the Medical Corps of the Royal Canadian Army and was stationed on the Aleutian Islands and later just behind the advancing front lines in Western Europe between 1942 and 1946. After the war, Henry returned to Revelstoke, where his wife taught until 1971, and he practiced until 1974. So he was one of the doctors that transitioned from the old hospital up to the new hospital, the current hospital. Dr. Armstrong was a well-known doctor as well, and I seem to have deleted the information I had on him. But he was here for quite a while as well until he moved into the Kootenays. Dr. Hugh John Mackay was born in Lethbridge in 1915 and received his medical degree from the University of Edinburgh in 1943. He served with the RCAF and then took a position at Shaughnessy Hospital. He came to Revelstoke in 1949, working with Dr. Hamer, and continued in practice here until 1969. And he left mostly over the decision to relocate the hospital outside of city limits. But he was, while he was here, he was one of the founding members of the Revelstoke and District Historical Society in 1958. That was the organization that's now the Revelstoke Museum and Archives Association. He moved to Sicamous and died there in 2006. A little photograph of this would be the Golden Spike Days Parade. And a couple of the nurses. So there was a big controversy over the new hospital. In 1968, there was it was really recognition that we desperately needed a new hospital. These are photographs that were taken in the old hospital, and they were in an issue of the newspaper supplement that came out in February of 1968, encouraging people to vote yes for a bylaw for the new hospital. And the reason that was a controversy was because the new hospital under the bylaw was going to be built in its current location on where it is up in Arrow Heights. And because there'd already been a decision made about the location. So the bylaw included that location there. And there were a lot of people who felt that, yes, we needed a new hospital, but it needed to be in city limits. Because at that time, Arrow Heights was outside of city limits. The city boundary until 1981 was Downey Street. So if you were on the south side of Downey Street, you were out of the city limits. And all of Arrow Heights was outside of the city limits. So there was a huge controversy. Why are we building a hospital outside of the city? And of course, one of the big reasons was because of available land. There wasn't much built up there at the time. But they included a lot of these photographs to show the conditions of the old hospital. This was a hospital cook, Ivy Smith. And actually have this photograph of her in later years at the new hospital. She was a fixture in the kitchen for many years. So this is some of the No campaign, and they put out these flyers, and they were taking out full-page ads in the newspaper. It said, "Your tax dollar will go further on an in-town site for Revelstoke. Vote no and force the hospital board to request the urban renewal site. Costs less by $400,000, eliminates additional water facilities to areas outside the city, reduces fire costs by 1 truck and 1 fire hall, allows sewer connects to city mains instead of a complete sewer plant and staff, makes sense for hospital users." So they were really encouraging people to vote no on the hospital referendum. Here's another one of their ads. "It's time for the truth. Why does the hospital board turn its face from the appeals of citizens who ask only the privilege of requesting a vote as to where their own hospital should be placed. Why does the hospital board persist in its present course of action in the face of staggering extra costs and inconveniences? Why does our city council, which is elected to protect the interests of the citizens, permit the hospital board to continue in its inflexible course of action? So if you think, if you go on Revelstoke Community Facebook page or you go on the Stoke list and you think that, wow, people have there's a lot of controversy now. There's always been controversy on pretty well any topic you could think of in town. So this was a major controversy. It did really split people. And as I say, we lost one of the major doctors here over it, Dr. Mckechney. The Revelstoke Review put out a supplement, a 12-page supplement supporting the yes decision. And that's where a lot of these photographs of the old hospital come from. It includes lots of reasons why you should be voting yes. It says your yes vote authorizes almost 2.6 million for Revelstoke Hospital and gives the costs. It says, but that's just one of many arguments that's outlined in this paper. And lots of photographs in here about what the conditions were like at the old hospital. These are photographs that were all appeared in this supplement. So there's some of the surgery equipment at the hospital. I believe we have some of these in storage in the museum here now because they are museum artifacts now. The children's ward, which he said was basically just 4 cots stuffed together in a corner. The men's ward. And so luckily the yes side, even with that that huge controversy, the bylaw was supported, and Revelstoke voted overwhelmingly for the hospital. 2,322 voted yes, 1,343 voted no. So it was still a considerable no vote. And as I say, I think the main concern was the location. One of the locations that people were talking about at the time was where the community center is now. But at the time, there was still the residue of an old sawmill there, so it wasn't seen as an appropriate site. So anyway, the bylaw passed, and they started construction of the new hospital. The sod turning ceremony was September 28th, 1968. And they had former nursing graduates, Vera Benison, Muriel Robinson, and Ella Connolly, joining Frank Prail, who was the hospital board chairman for the sod turning. And then the hospital was officially opened after some delays, construction delays. It was opened on December 19th, 1970. And they had several speeches. Said one of the addresses was P.V. Lonzo, that's Vince Lonzo, who at the time was on the building chairman for the Hospital Society, Mayor Don Gillespie, and representatives from various levels of government. So the hospital officially opened in 1970. There's a few pictures of it when it was first built. And in so the old hospital was torn down in 1972. And I think a lot of people ended up purchasing bricks from the old hospital. And when we built the Heritage Garden in 2004, we were able to access bricks. Jack Leslie still had a stash of bricks in his yard. So we were able to get some bricks, and the posts on the back end of our Heritage Garden were made from bricks from the hospital. The ones on the front were bricks from the old CPR station. So we're able to incorporate some old history into that. These are some of the early doctors at the new hospital. Dr. Tom Taylor, who later moved to Kelowna, Dr. Mark Longhurst, and Dr. Longhurst had been at both hospitals as well. And then, of course, Dr. Jeff Battersby, who came to Revelstoke really just as the controversy was raging about about where the hospital was going to be built, and he served there for many years. I actually saw him last week. They were up for a visit, and Nurse Mona Barron, who was also a fixture at the hospital and the clinic for many years. I mentioned the hospital auxiliary. They have been operating now for, as I said, since 1901, and are still really an important fixture in our community. Zida Crawford, in one of the thrift shops. They've had many locations over the years until they built their current building. And I know it was 1999 they had purchased the property, so it was just after that they built it. The note in the newspaper when they purchased the property said that over the past 10 years they'd raised $500,000 for equipment at Queen Victoria Hospital. In 2020, which is the last year that I could find data for, they had donated more than $167,000 to the health needs of the community. That included a donation to the food bank, as well as over $138,000 in hospital equipment. So they're still very important to the health needs of our community. Just an incredible amount of, I don't think you could even begin to tally the volunteer hours that they've put in over 120 years. Just really phenomenal. The Mount Cartier Court Residential Care Facility opened in 2006. An addition was built in 2007. One of the things I wanted to mention about the hospital, when in you know the circle in there, for many years there was a fountain in there, and I'm not sure when the fountain disappeared, but it was put in there in 1976. It was called the Chalice of Life, and it was a memorial to Fred Brewski Sr. It was commissioned by his wife Kay Brewski in 1976. And it was designed and sculpted by Ilak Imredi, who was a sculptor from Vancouver, BC. It was known as Intaglio, and the design incorporated the human motif in several phases. So it was really an iconic part of the hospital for many years. Some of you will also remember the beautiful gardens that used to be at the back of the hospital, and those were designed in 1977 by Roy Sumi, who was a really well-known Japanese landscape architect. He's the one that designed the Nitobi Gardens at UBC, and also the Japanese gardens in New Denver. I believe that most of the garden was sort of removed when they built the cottages. So it's a bit of a loss to the community and to the overall look of the hospital grounds. But certainly the Mount Cartier Court is an important part of our community there. I go up once a month. In fact, I'm scheduled to go up tomorrow and do a little presentation of local history for the residents. The helipad was opened on October 27th, 2008. And again, that was sort of a huge fundraising effort by a lot of individuals and organizations in the community. This was a parade of the emergency vehicles that paraded through all through the community on April 5th, 2020, to show support for healthcare workers during the early weeks of the pandemic. And I also remember, going out on my front steps to ring a bell at 7 o'clock, to support the healthcare workers as well, and make a little bit of noise. So the hospital has seen lots of concerns over the years. I think most people agree that we're really lucky in Revelstoke to have the healthcare services that we have, and even though there's things that we have to go out of town for, our in-town services is really remarkable. So before I end, just want to let people know that our next talk in 2 weeks is on Revelstoke's Japanese community. And also let you know that we've got a special presentation next Thursday at 7 o'clock in the museum. It's the 20th anniversary of the first publication of the Geography of Memory by author Eileen Delahanty Perks. It's a history of the Sinixt people. And found in the newspaper, it was almost exactly 20 years ago that she presented her book for the first time when the first edition came out. And they've got a really beautifully expanded new edition. And she'll be speaking along with Shelley Boyd and also another scholar from the States, scholar in Sinixt history, who will be here to do a presentation. So that's next Thursday, the October 20th at 7 p.m. So I encourage you to come out for that, and there's no charge for that event. So thank you for coming, and thank you for my online audience as well. And, just going to